Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jim Jones, the commander of Lieutenant Ezra Griffin Camp Number 8, Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War, and I welcome you to the annual observance of Memorial Day, hosted by Camp 8, the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Association, and the Ladies Auxiliary Number 10. To start our observance, we'll recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Color bearer, 2 step forward. Will our patriots please come forward? And salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, boys. I'd like to introduce our young patriots, Anders and Brick and Eric. Thank you, boys. Here. Color bearer, 2 steps rear, please. I'd now like to introduce Sister Julie Esty, our Ladies Auxiliary Unit Number 10, who will lead us in our opening prayer.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, guide, we beseech Thee, the nations of the world into the way of truth, and establish among them that peace which is the fruit of justice. We remember before Thee on this Memorial Day all those men and women of our community who have given their lives in the service of our country, beseeching Thee to grant them light and refreshment in Thy divine presence. Strengthen and protect all those who are serving in the armed forces of our country. Support them in the day of battle and in time of peace. Keep them safe from evil, endow them with courage and loyalty, and grant that in all things they serve without reproach. Amen.
Thank you, Julie. Sister Mary Jo Long is a member of the Women's Relief Corps. Mary Jo.
Good morning. I bring you my greetings from the Comrade Gabriel Detached Corps of the Women's Relief Corps. Also my own personal greetings. I've given these greetings many times at Dunmore Cemetery, and it occurred to me recently that people probably don't know what the Women's Relief Corps is. It was the original auxiliary to the GAR. It was formed to initially keep patriotism alive and teach the school children and other people about the GAR. And in the meantime, they found out that there was a need to take care of the veterans. So initially they raised money through many forms of patriotism, and one of them was to make quilts and sell squares. And doing this, they were able to purchase cemetery lots, and that enabled families to be buried together. So there's only around 2,000 of the Women's Relief Corps left, but it still continues. Thank you so much for being here today.
Please be seated. $50% off on our gigantic Memorial Day sale. On this Memorial Day, get lifetime oil changes with every vehicle you purchase. One day only, special deals on hamburgers and kibasi for your barbecue. Memorial Day, the unofficial day of the start of summer fun. This is what the media and advertising tells us our focus should be today. Shopping, thinking of fun, planning gatherings with family and friends. Okay, that's modern day life. But we also need to pause to reflect on the legacy of countless thousands of Americans who have fought, suffered, and died so that we can wake up this morning, see those ads, read those banners, look forward to summer fun, and go about our day-to-day lives with freedom, security, and self-determination. The legacy I'm referring to is more than a monetary inheritance. It's a call to honor someone's memory and to keep alive the traditions, values, and visions that this poor person fought and died to pass on to us, to assure us that our one united nation under God will remain a beacon of hope, freedom, and light, with liberty and justice for all. Since 1868, Americans have gathered on a day like today to honor the boys in blue, those who rest in eternal peace here and in places like this across the country. We come here out of respect for those fighting men and women, and to remember those who have died for us and those who now walk in the shadow of harm for us. We are grateful to you. We remember you. We respect you. We honor you. We preserve your legacy, and most of all, we thank you. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the music.
One, two, ready, play.
band has been a fixture of our Memorial Day celebrations for a long time. Thank you again. In 1868, U.S. Congressman General John A. Logan, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, issued General Order Number 11. Another young patriot, Adam McCormick, is going to tell us just what it said. Adam?
The 30th day of May, 1968, is designated for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who had died in defense of their country during the late rebellion, and whose bodies now lie in almost every city, village, and hamlet churchyard in the land. In this observance, no form or ceremony is prescribed, but posts and comrades will in their own way arrange such fitting services and testimonials of respect as circumstances may permit. We are organized, comrades, as our regulations tell us, for the purpose, among other things, of preserving, strengthening those kind and fraternal feelings which have bound together the soldiers, sailors, and Marines who united to suppress the late rebellion. What can aid more to assure this result than by cherishing tenderly the memory of our heroic dead who made their breasts a barricade between our country and its foes? Their soldiers' lives were the reveille of freedom to a race in chains, and their death the tattoo of rebellious tyranny in arms. We should guard their graves with sacred vigilance. All that the consecrated wealth and taste of the nation can add to their adornment and security is but a fitting tribute to the memory of her slain defenders. Let no wanton foot tread rudely on such hallowed ground. Let pleasant paths invite the coming and going of reverent visitors and fond mourners. Let no vandalism of avarice or neglect, nor ravages of time testify to the present or to the coming generations that we have forgotten, as a people, the cost of a free and undivided republic. If other eyes grow dull, and other hands slack, and other hearts cold in solemn trust, ours shall keep it well, as long as the light and warmth of life remains in us. Let us then, at the time appointed, gather around their sacred remains and garland the passionless mounds above them with the choicest flowers of springtime. Let us raise above them the dear old flag they saved from dishonor. Let us, in this solemn presence, renew our pledges to aid and assist those whom they have left among us as sacred charges upon the nation's gratitude, the soldiers and sailors' widows and orphans. It is the purpose of the Commander-in-Chief to inaugurate this observance with the hope that it will be kept up from year to year, while the survivor of war remains to honor the memory of his departed comrades. He earnestly desires the public press to call attention to this order and lend its friendly aid in bringing it to the notice of comrades in all parts of the country in time for simultaneous compliance therewith. Department commanders will use every effort to make this order effective.
Adam, thank you very much. I do appreciate your reading. Our keynote speaker today is William E. Fisher. Brother Fisher is a member of our Camp Number 8. Since 2016, Bill has served as Chief of Visitor Services and Resource Management at our own Steamtown National Historic Site. Prior to returning to Pennsylvania, he was a historian at Fort Scott National Historic Site in Kansas. Bill joined the Armed Forces in 1976 and served with the Army 82nd Airborne Division. He was a Minuteman ICBM crew commander in Montana. Bill holds undergraduate degrees from The Ohio State University and from the College of Great Falls, and a master's degree from the University of Georgia. Bill served as Assistant Professor of History at the United States Air Force Academy. Brother Fisher completed his career as Chief of the Battle Space Support Branch within the National Aerospace Intelligence at Wright Air Force Base in Ohio, retiring with the rank of Major. Bill joined the Union veterans of the Civil War as a descendant of Roman Braun, a German immigrant who served the Indiana Cavalry, and Hiram Foster, who served aboard the USS Hartford, Admiral Farragut's flagship. Bill helped organize and served as the first camp commander of McKinley Camp 21 in Ohio, and later was organizer of Humboldt Camp No. 9, Department of Kansas. While living in Kansas, Bill served in the position of Department Senior Vice Commander before moving to Northeast Pennsylvania. He currently serves as a Department of Pennsylvania Graves Registration Officer. Bill will be providing us with a brief history of the United States colored troops during the Civil War. Bill?
I'll try not to pop my peas too often. Thank you all for being here. It's really, thank you. Sorry. It's really nice that you took a little bit of time out of your 3-day weekend. And I especially give a shout out to the Dunmore High School band. I was a band parent from 15 to 20 years ago, with a son who played trumpet, a daughter who played mellophone, and another son who played trombone. So they would go to 4 separate ceremonies every Memorial Day in Fairfield County, Ohio, the birthplace of William Tecumseh Sherman. And I hope that you will, in the future, look at this as a very important part of your high school experience, and not as just another routine thing that you have to do. It's very rare to have young people who will take time out of a 3-day weekend so close to the end of the school year. So thank you very much again. When war began in 1861, it was to be quick and decisive. Perhaps one great battle in the war would be over. American and European theorists had based their strategy and tactics by studying the great decisive battles of Napoleon. So people poured out of Washington, D.C., Alexandria, and Arlington to see the anticipated one great battle of the American Civil War at Manassas, Virginia, also known as Bull Run. Just as background, the United States typically named Civil War battles and armies based on nearby waterways, hence the Army of the Potomac, etc., while the Confederacy named armies and battles on location. So the name Bull Run and Manassas for the same battle. However, the failure to find that one great decisive battle meant that casualties rose year after year. An anticipated quick war became a war of attrition that ground on, exacting hundreds of thousands of casualties in its wake. Such a war required more and more soldiers, which eventually led to the enlistment of men of African descent as soldiers in the Army of the United States. Such was not an easy decision, but 2 years into the war, in May 1863, the Bureau of Colored Troops was created to organize regiments of black men led by white officers. While individual men of color had served in the American military since the days of the Revolution, they had not served in large numbers nor been organized into segregated companies or regiments. While many argued then, and some still argue today, that the Civil War was not about slavery, many staunch abolitionists were given high rank in Abraham Lincoln's politically charged United States Army. These abolitionists often kept the issues of enslavement and emancipation in the political discussion. Within months of the war's start, Benjamin Butler, commanding Fort Monroe along coastal Virginia, refused to return to their masters several self-liberated people who arrived at the fort seeking refuge. Butler called those formerly enslaved as contraband of war. Contraband was any type of property that could be used by the enemy to wage war. And since enslaved people were considered property, Butler's decision made perfect sense in his abolitionist mind. A few months later, Congress agreed and passed the Confiscation Act of 1861, which declared that any property, including slaves, used by the Confederate military could be confiscated by United States forces. 1 year after Butler's actions, in May 1862, another politically appointed abolitionist-minded general named David Hunter, then commanding the United States forces that had secured a foothold along the southern Atlantic coastline, issued an order declaring all persons in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, quote, heretofore held as slaves, are therefore declared free forever, end quote. When he received word of the declaration, President Lincoln very likely incurred some severe gastrointestinal issues and distress and immediately rescinded that order. Undeterred, Hunter unilaterally began enlisting many of the formerly enslaved who had fled across Union lines to form the first South Carolina, in parentheses, African descent, identifying them as a black unit, the first black regiment organized during the Civil War. One can only further imagine Lincoln's distress as the president was working really, really hard to ensure that the border states, in particular Kentucky, did not secede. When Secretary of War Edwin Stanton demanded an explanation, Hunter replied that, quote, no regiment of fugitive slaves has been or is organized. There is, however, a fine regiment of persons whose late masters are fugitive rebels, end quote. Such overt acts of defiance by military men in the field were becoming more commonplace and influencing the politics of Washington, D.C. James Lane, one of Kansas's first U.S. senators, remembering that Kansas became a state in January of 1861, returned home to organize the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment as a state unit in August 1862. Several companies of formerly enslaved men, now 1st Kansas Colored Infantry soldiers, marched into Missouri in late October 1862, where they were met by an overwhelming force of pro-Confederate guerrillas who attacked with a vengeance. While the Battle of Island Mound, Missouri is categorized as a skirmish that seems irrelevant to the clash of the Titanic armies east of the Mississippi, Island Mound was a pivotal importance to the course of the war. Being the first time that blacks fought in combat as a unit, and although outnumbered at least 2 to 1, they heroically stood their ground, suffering 8 killed and 11 wounded in action, and winning the day. One of the Confederate guerrillas was later quoted in the New York Times and other northern newspapers declaring, quote, the black devils fought like tigers, not one would surrender, end quote. The Chicago Tribune further declared, quote, their performance is so encouraging that it is useless to talk anymore about Negro courage, end quote. Such conduct was reported across the nation, and I personally am convinced that the actions of the 1st Kansas Colored at Island Mound emboldened President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation barely 2 months later. Had they dropped their weapons and fled, who knows what would have happened with regard to the Emancipation Proclamation. Even lesser known today is that Lieutenant Patrick Minor became the first black commissioned officer to lead troops in combat. He was a Kansas State officer. Unfortunately, Minor and another African American, Captain William Matthews, both commissioned Kansas State officers, were later denied commissions when black troops were federalized under the Bureau of Colored Troops. Nonetheless, the courage of the men of the 1st Kansas Colored, many who had been enslaved only months earlier, and their devotion to duty at Island Mound, Missouri, soon after led to the widespread enlistment of free and formerly enslaved African Americans across the United States. So we've made it through the first 2 years of the American Civil War to the May 1863 establishment of the Bureau of Colored Troops, which consolidated and federalized the various black units formed by the United States Army and northern states. Within weeks, Camp William Penn was established outside Philadelphia and soon became the largest such camp established in the United States to train African Americans as soldiers. More than 10,500 men of color were trained at Camp William Penn. At least 2 prominent local men served as white officers in colored troop regiments. Edward Willard, a Scranton attorney who later served as a justice in the First Superior Court of Pennsylvania, commanded Company B, 127th United States Colored Infantry. And Frederick Hitchcock, later Director of Public Works and Treasurer for the city of Scranton, who had served as an officer in the 127th Pennsylvania Infantry, became Colonel commanding the 25th United States Colored Infantry. Hitchcock is interred here in Dunmore Cemetery. But the real focus should be on the enlisted men who served. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., you can easily use the Metro to visit the African American Civil War Museum. On the outdoor plaza is a striking monument and honor roll listing the names of every known black Civil War soldier and sailor. But one does not need to travel to the nation's capital to remember. Northeast Pennsylvania has a rich abolitionist, Underground Railroad, and black communal history. And at least 2 United States colored troops are interred in this cemetery. At the northern edge of the Grand Army of the Republic soldiers plot, next to that first large pine tree by the side of the gate, the old gate, is the grave of Private George W. Keyes. Keyes was born in Abington Township, Luzerne County. Remembering that Luzerne County was this county until 1878, when Lackawanna County was established from part of Luzerne County. Lackawanna County is also the last county that Pennsylvania organized. George Keyes was a Pennsylvania farm boy who stood only 5 feet 4 inches tall. Undeterred that a typical Springfield rifled musket was only 8 inches shorter than his height, and if you put a bayonet on it, it probably topped his height, he enrolled as a private in Company F, 22nd United States Colored Infantry, which was organizing at Camp William Penn, when he joined on January 11, 1864, at age 18. Within a month, the regiment was transported to Yorktown, Virginia, and soon moved to participate in the bitter fighting and siege of Petersburg. The unit sustained heavy casualties in some attacks against the lines at Petersburg. It then took part in the occupation of the Confederate capital of Richmond in early April 1865 before moving to Washington, D.C. to participate in President Lincoln's funeral procession from the White House to the Capitol, where he was to lie in state. The unit then assisted in pursuing Lincoln's assassins on Maryland's eastern shore. In late May 1865, the war technically being over, the regiment moved to Texas for duty along the Rio Grande. Private George Keyes was discharged at Brownsville, Texas in mid-September 1865. In roughly 15 months of wartime service and another 6 months of peacekeeping, the 22nd United States Colored Infantry Regiment lost 70 enlisted men in battle and another 144 enlisted men to disease, the ratio being typical for any regiment in the Civil War. George returned to the Waverly area, then moved to Scranton, where he served as a laborer and later in life as a coachman. Somewhere along the way he married and either divorced or was widowed, apparently not having any children. Poignantly, George Keyes died in 1908 in Lenox Township, Susquehanna County. What day, you might ask? July 4th, a day that undoubtedly took on much more meaning for African Americans who fought to end slavery, preserve the Union, and liberate their people. Notably, George's father, also named George, also served in the same unit. He is buried in Waverly. African Americans served admirably and with great courage in Civil War battles all across the United States, including the desperate struggle at Petersburg, Virginia, which ultimately led to the fall of the Confederacy. Despite the threat of no quarter, with captured black soldiers and their white officers routinely executed on the spot, roughly 160,000 African Americans willingly enlisted and served in the United States Army, and another 40,000 served in the United States Navy. Of those, it is estimated that approximately 138,000 were formerly enslaved. While Kentucky, a border state with a large enslaved population, enrolled the most soldiers of color, more than 8,500 black Pennsylvanians served, which is more than any other northern free state. Remember William Matthews and Patrick Minor, who were denied officers' commissions because of their race when state units were federalized in 1863? Both received United States Army commissions late in the war, being two of approximately 120 African Americans who served as officers by war's end. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Patrick Minor died of disease at Leavenworth, Kansas, only weeks before the Confederacy collapsed. On the day the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted on New Year's Day, 1863, Captain William Matthews spoke to the assembled members of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry at Fort Scott. Among many poignant remarks, he declared, quote, "If we fight, we will be respected," end quote. African Americans indeed fought and were respected. They should receive no more recognition and honor than any others who served in the American Civil War, but they certainly should receive no less recognition and honor. So thank you for honoring all of our fallen this Memorial Day.
Bill, thank you very much for that very inspiring speech. I'm proud to introduce my friend Joseph Long, Jr. Joe is an officer of Camp Number 8 and is a member of the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Association. Joe?
I'm here to talk about the GAR Memorial Association. They are in charge of our Civil War Museum downtown in Scranton at City Hall. If you want any information about the museum after the ceremony, I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. I just want to point out here that this is a Civil War plot. On my right here is the Spanish-American War plot. In the Cathedral Cemetery, they have a Civil War plot, and they also have a Spanish-American War plot, but they have a World War I military plot there, just for your own information. But we have a lot of artifacts down at our museum, and we're open at least one weekend a month, normally the 3rd Thursday of the month. So I'll answer your questions after the service. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I'd like to just reemphasize what Joe has said about the museum. If you haven't been there, it's a wonderful place to do genealogical research and to immerse yourselves in the artifacts of the Civil War. And I highly recommend anyone who is interested to come on down. It's a family-friendly museum, and we really appreciate anyone who comes to visit. I now take pleasure in introducing Sister Susan Mertz, the President of the Pennsylvania Department of the Auxiliary to the Sons of the Civil War. Sister Susan will lay our wreath at the Civil War Monument. Thank you, Susan. In keeping with the provisions of General Logan's Order of 1868, the Sisters of Auxiliary 10, along with any children who would like to help out, will scatter flower petals on the Civil War grave. It's been done already. Okay. We're going to ask Sister Susan Mertz to come back to the podium. and to read for us what is probably one of the most lasting speeches ever written by an American president, and that is the Gettysburg Address.
I'm not just going to give the address, I'm going to give you a little context about the address. When President Lincoln left Washington for Gettysburg, he was very ill. When he returned, he was diagnosed with smallpox. So all the time that he was in Gettysburg to help get the National Cemetery started, he was quite ill. Additionally, his son Tad had a fever, and they weren't sure if he was going to live the night. So Mary Lincoln stayed home, but the president felt compelled to come to Gettysburg. 4 months earlier, 58,300 forces engaged there, leaving 51,000 casualties and over 3,100 Union dead, over 3,900 Confederate dead. Although we're here at the GAR plot, there are still 22,000 Civil War soldiers that are missing in action, buried in unmarked graves all up and down the East Coast. So while we remember those in cemeteries, we have to remember those who never made it home. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but they must never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us here to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom and government of the people, for the people, and by the people, shall not perish from the earth. A little plug for the museum again. When I was young, I had an aunt that loved to tell family stories, and I listened to her. So I became the family genealogist when I was young. All the times we recited the Gettysburg Address in school, I never knew that I had family that had fought at that battle, and many battles all over. We have a lot of records there. I hope that people will take an interest in their family history, because your family history is your nation's history. Thank you.
I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that Scranton Mayor Wetzel is here. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us. And now I once again call on the talents of the Dunmore High School Band to lead us in singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The words of the song are on the back of your program. I ask you to please stand while the honor guard files a salute.
Fire! Ready? Aim! Fire! Ready? Aim! Fire! Cover! Present! Arms!
Julie S.C. for our benediction.
I'd like to close today's services with a prayer from an 1843 copy of Psalms and Hymns adapted to social, private, and public worship in the Presbyterian Church. This particular copy belonged to a member of the Mylard family, and while I cannot establish which Mylard this book belonged to, it's fitting that we use it today, as Sergeant William Mylard, who served during the Civil War with Company C, 42nd PA Militia, is buried on Block 12, and Second Lieutenant Charles Mylard, who served during the war with Company A, 132nd Regiment PA Volunteers, is at rest in the larger family plot on Block 21. Please bow your heads. Dismiss us with thy blessings, Lord. Help us to feed upon thy word. All that has been amiss, forgive, and let thy truth within us live. Safe travels to all of you on your way home.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program for Memorial Day 2019. I sincerely want to thank you for joining us, and especially want to thank our young patriots and each person who participated in this observance. As you return home, remember what this day is all about. May God bless America. Thank you.